After Gustavus Adolphus's involvement in the 30 Years' War, the Kingdom of Sweden managed to manifest itself as the dominant power in Northern Europe. At its pinnacle, Sweden controlled Finland, Livonia, the city of Riga, Pomerania, Wismar, and even the Duchy of Bremen-Verden. Today, however, we're going to take a look at Sweden's other, not so long-lived and not so impressively large empire, its colonial possessions that spun across 3 continents. A few years after Gustavus Adolphus's death, High Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna was approached by a Dutch businessman called Samuel Blommert. Blommert was a former employee of the Dutch West India Company and one of the most influential advocates for a colonial expedition. He argued that a trading post in North America would strengthen Swedish commerce in the Atlantic and enrich the royal treasury. It would also ensure that Sweden had a share in the immensely profitable tobacco and fur trade, and potentially even open up new possibilities for expansion. To finance this whole operation, the New Sweden Company was founded, where both the Swedish crown and some Dutch investors had a stake in. It was proposed that another former Dutch West India Company employee called Peter Mennoud should lead the expedition. In the years between 1626 and 1632, he was a very capable governor in the province of New Netherland, before he got kicked out, for unknown reasons. The first expedition, consisting of 2 ships, left Gothenburg in late autumn of 1637. In March of the following year, the settlers arrived at the Delaware Bay and began construction of a fort which they named after their queen, Christina. For the time being, they didn't care about the fact that this area was already claimed by the Dutch, and decided to call this land New Sweden. But now began the difficult part, consolidating the new colony. But in order to do that, you need settlers, and in 1640 the number of people living in New Sweden was probably less than 30, and it would only grow to 368 in the following 14 years. Most people just weren't that interested in travelling months to an unknown piece of land far away from their friends and family. On top of that, the situation in this disputed territory at the mercy of Native American tribes seemed very unsafe in the average Swede's eyes. To combat the lack of settlers, the crown resorted to pardoning petty criminals like adulterers by offering to send them to New Sweden instead of prison. This was seen as a way to improve and strengthen a person's character. Deserters and draft dodgers were also forced to go aboard a ship and leave for the New World. In an attempt to cope with their homesickness and despair, many settlers took a number of personal objects with them, like books, tableware, clothes, and many more. It was ordered that Swedish be the sole language spoken in the settlement, and that everything in the landscape receive a familiar Swedish name. This was done in an attempt to strengthen the tie between the colony and the motherland, and also to make the settlers' lives a bit less miserable. Houses were built in a style that was familiar to home, traditions like beer brewing were imported, and the settlements were structured in a very familiar way. For additional growth, even more land was purchased from the local Lenape tribe along the Delaware River. In the early 1640s, when the colony seemed to be stable enough, the borders were clearly established, and it officially became a proper part of the Swedish crown, where it received monthly subsidies. Even more settlements like Fort Nya Älvsborg and Nya Stockholm were founded. The relationship with the natives was good for the most part, and all the land was legally purchased to counter any potential claims from other European countries. But did Sweden fulfill the dreams of massively increased wealth? Not really. The colony received nowhere near enough goods and supplies from the homeland to compete with the other European powers. Instead, the colonists usually bought goods from the Dutch and English colonies, traded them for fur with the natives, and sent that fur back to Europe. Because most of their efforts were focused on growing tobacco, the colony became reliant on the neighbouring tribes for food. As a result, it became sort of a middle ground between Sweden, the natives, and the other European powers, without ever becoming a self-sustaining entity. Not that it mattered a lot, because New Sweden did not survive for long. In 1655, just 17 years after the first ships landed, the Dutch invaded. They sensed an opportunity to finally get their hands on the Delaware after Sweden invaded the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and would most likely be distracted by the more urgent affairs in Europe. It was not a difficult campaign, and all of the forts and settlements surrendered rather quickly. The settlers swore loyalty to the Dutch and were in turn granted an extensive degree of autonomy and the right to keep their possessions and stay. Sweden would never make any effort to gain their honestly failed colony back. In 1649, the Swedish Africa Company, with its headquarters in Stade, was founded by the Dutch-Swedish trader Louis de Geer. De Geer had made a fortune during the 30 Years' War with his monopoly on the copper and iron export. After his copper and iron charter ended in 1648, he began to envision big plans for building a trade empire along the African Gold Coast. A first expedition, led by Henrik Karloff, a skilled explorer, was sent to Africa 1 year later. Karloff managed to strike a deal with the King of Futu and acquired a small portion of land, which he began to rule as the first governor. The first fort was built in 1653 and named Carolusborg after King Charles X. Shortly after, even more forts followed, and for a while at least, the company was doing quite well. Over the span of 8 years, goods worth about 1.5 million guilders were brought to Africa. Those goods consisted of clothing, glass beads, and household items made of copper. They were traded for gold, ivory, or sugar. The Swedish Africa Company was involved in the slave trade as well, but only to a very limited extent. Only about 400 slaves were sent to Sao Tome to work for the sugar plantations. The company was about as successful as the Dutch West India Company, who was starting to become their biggest rivals. Things went downhill really quickly, however, when Henrik Karloff was accused by the board of directors of extensive private trading. Enraged, he left the company in 1657 and switched sides to the Danish crown, who also had an interest in the region. 1 year later, he returned on board of the Danish privateer Glückstadt and quickly conquered Fort Carolusborg. But because of the ongoing war between Denmark and Sweden, Karloff decided to sell the fort to the Dutch. In 1660, the Swedish Africa Company managed to retake the fort, only to then get kicked out by the Dutch again 3 years later. In the end, though, the English arrived and took the fort for themselves, which they would keep for the next 300 years. Oh yeah, and just so I don't forget it, in 1733 the otherwise very successful Swedish East India Company founded a trading post in Porto Novo, which is modern-day Parangipetai, in India. The trading post was destroyed a month later by the French and the British East India Companies. And that's about it. Now we're going to talk about Sweden's most successful colonization project. Inspired by Denmark's success in the rich Caribbean, the Swedish crown decided that it was time again to embark on a new adventure. In 1784, King Gustavus III received the island of Saint-Barthélemy from the French in exchange for French trading privileges in Gothenburg. The French knew what they were doing because they considered this barren island as one of their least valuable possessions. After their arrival, the Swedes were confronted with a local population that consisted of about 40% slaves of African ancestry. Seeing as there aren't many goods other than salt and cotton that you can harvest on Saint-Barthélemy, the Swedes decided to turn the island into a free port and to also participate in the slave trade. Slaves could now be imported to Saint-Barthélemy by any nation without any taxes, and only a small fee had to be paid when a ship left. The problem was that in the late 18th century, Denmark had already outlawed the slave trade, and the abolitionist movement in Great Britain was growing stronger year by year. The British Society for the Abolition of Slavery sent a well-known Swedish abolitionist, Anders Sparrman, to King Gustavus III in order to convince him of their cause, and the king promised that he would do everything in his power to make sure that nobody in Sweden was involved in the Atlantic slave trade. And indeed, even if some Swedish subjects partook in it, no Swedish ship ever legally traded with slaves. The port of Gustavia, the island's capital, flourished especially when war broke out between Britain and the US in 1812, as both sides needed a neutral port to conduct trade in. And even then, there is very little evidence to suggest that this wealth was brought about because of the slave trade, and when the war ended, the island's wealth stagnated. The slave trade was made illegal in 1813. Slavery itself remained legal, however, until 1847. The slave owners were compensated with up to $240 per slave, depending on the age. And so ended one of Sweden's darkest chapters, even if its involvement may have been less impactful than that of other nations. After the mid-19th century, the island started to become more of a financial burden than anything else. An epidemic and a devastating drought had reduced the population to just above 2,000, and as a result, fewer and fewer ships docked at Gustavia. In 1877, negotiations with the French were reopened, discussing the eventual return of the island, and indeed, 1 year later, Saint-Barthélemy was returned to France, where it remains to this day.